Thank you so much, and I'd like to welcome Onyeka Cindy Ojogbo, Director at Centurion Law. She's the moderator of our next panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Hope we had a good time yesterday and ready for the sessions today. I'd like to welcome you guys to the panel today, which is titled Enabling Regulatory Frameworks, How Regulators Can Shape the Future of the Oil and Gas Industry, Attract Investors, Promote Local Content, and Incentivize a Transition. For this panel, we have distinguished speakers, and I would like to welcome all my speakers on stage at this moment, please. Okay, before we start with the actual discussion, I would like each of the panelists to please introduce themselves briefly, one after the other, so that our audience know who we're hearing from today. We'll start with Zion. Can we start with you?
Okay, I'm Zion Adeoye, Managing Director, Centurion Law Group.
Good morning. I am Megan Rodgers, Director at Cliffe, Dekker, Hofmeyr Attorneys, based in Cape Town, South Africa, and also the sector head of the oil and gas sector at Cliffe, Dekker, Hofmeyr.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Not too clearly.
Yes, good morning. My name is Leoncio Amada. I'm the IEC head of the CEMAC region, also the founder of Apex Industries.
Great. And so we'll just go right in. The topic is on regulation, and as we know, regulation is very important for investment in any country. Now, Nigeria, for example, and Ghana have been able to create balanced regulatory framework to drive up local content and investment. And I'd like to ask our panelists, what lessons do you think other African regulators can learn from these countries? Nigeria with the PIA recently, and Ghana with their recent investment laws. So any of the panelists feels comfortable jumping in?
Okay, well, probably I'd take this because you mentioned Nigeria. Well, I think when it comes to regulation, it's probably the tool that is able to respond to emergencies, and it's able to respond to each dispensation as they come. As you know, when you have your body of laws, you have the policies, then you have the laws, and then you have the regulations, you know, that can come from dispensation to dispensation, depending on what the policy of the government is at that particular time. I think why we're talking about this and why this is very topical is because we are in a new dispensation in the oil and gas sector where we have to use regulation, which is a multiple-edged sword, to deal with the issues we're having. So many things that we've had in the past, the way the industry runs. For example, local content, where you have a lot of that placed on the IOCs to benefit the local private sector. Some of those things will have to change through new regulation. You cannot no longer tax Peter to pay Paul. You have to incentivize local private sector separately, you know, from what the IOCs would have to bring to the plate. So things are changing rapidly, and regulators must understand that they have to look at the exact dispensation and deploy regulatory innovations to ensure that the industry can still thrive.
Leoncio, I want to hear from you on this one.
Yes, thank you, Onika. As I have been always saying, regulation, you know, are the engine of any economy. Look, Ghana has done a very good job when it comes to regulations. In fact, it's not a surprise that we have companies like Springfield, you know, in Ghana, owned by Kevin Okere. It's because Ghana has really set up, you know, attractive incentives, you know, to incentivize people to invest in Ghana. Same thing when it comes to Google. Why did they choose Ghana? Because the country does incentivize foreign investment. Same thing as Twitter. It's not a coincidence that they're going to Ghana. It's because Ghana is really making a good job in that aspect. I have always been saying that economic right is a human right. People have the right to prosper and to do well economically. Governments are there just to create and to incentivize, you know, the business environment. When you look at the Doing Business Index, most African countries, you know, are not well placed in that index. Why? Because government are really putting out there anti-business regulations. They are trying to really tax the companies, but they forget one thing. Companies are job creators and wealth creators. So you cannot tax the companies and expect the people to do well, because those same guys are the ones that are creating businesses and jobs, for our people. So what I would say is that Africans, Elon Musk, he was born in this country, right? Yeah. And he left. Now he's the strongest man in the world. Why is that? Because he went to a place where, the environment allowed him to really attain his full potential. Africa, I think we can do the same, We can emulate from those countries. And so I think we have some young kids here in Africa that are trying to do well. And I think they just need, the business environment to advise them to do well. Thank you.
Thanks, Leoncio. And while I'm still on you, and we touched on Ghana and Nigeria recently creating laws that might attract investment into the country, I want to talk on the CEMAC regulation, which is a new regulation in that region that there has been a lot of uproar about. And I know that is your region. So, is that a burden for IOCs and foreign companies coming into the region? What do you anticipate is the effect of that legislation?
I think in the CEMAC region, we have, a central bank, which is called BEAC, as you know. BEAC has put in place a forex exchange regulation that really prevents and is killing jobs in the CEMAC region. I have been saying this, for almost a year now. But that was imposed, by the IMF, the World Bank, and by France onto BEAC. And BEAC just got along and implement that regulation. Now it's killing jobs, and it's really making it difficult for oil companies to come to invest into CEMAC area. Same goes to local companies as well. Because right now, for you to buy some equipment out of the USA or Europe or Dubai or China, you need the BEAC to approve, that transaction. And sometimes it takes you 3 to 4 months for them to approve one payment. Now, you tell me, how do you expect a local company that doesn't have offshore accounts to compete with guys like Schlumberger? When those guys, they can operate from outside the country, buy the stuff, and ship them. So by doing so, they are actually killing our economies. So you tell me how BEAC can say they want to really make sure that we grow as local companies if at the same time they are killing us? Doesn't make sense. And I think that we, at the chamber, and this I'm going to do it with NJ, we would put a lawsuit against BEAC because it's killing the economy that they're supposed to protect. And that will happen very soon.
Interesting. Megan, just off the back of what Leoncio just talked about, right? So the CEMAC region have passed a law that is potentially killing local companies. What is your experience in the oil and gas industry in South Africa? And what do you think, these regulators should look out for in passing these types of laws?
So from a South African perspective, we of course currently have a change in legislative regime. We're moving from a mining-focused piece of legislation which incorporated oil and gas activities into a more focused upstream petroleum resources development bill. So we are essentially in a transition phase, and I think there are a lot of jurisdictions emerging who aren't as advanced as Ghana and Nigeria, such as Namibia. South Africa is definitely one of those cases. And the transition is tough, right? Investor certainty is fundamental to the sector, and a change in laws ultimately creates uncertainty for the investor. So there's a pause on exploration and production activities until such time as your legislative regime is sound and offers a certain package to investors. This is currently where we are as South Africa, and we hope to achieve the outcomes of Ghana and Nigeria in ultimately putting together a package for investors. We're an emerging jurisdiction, very frontier, which is bankable and investable, and we compete with countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Namibia, right? So African states compete for this type of investment. So what is fundamental for an African state is, of course, to understand your jurisdiction, know that you are frontier, and that exploration activities need to be incentivized through your legislation. And then just touching on the earlier point, it is fundamental that we don't only do this in the context of the specific upstream legislation or the host government agreement. There's a framework of laws that connect to this industry. So if we have exchange control regulations which disincentivize investment or hold up investment, it doesn't matter that we have this fantastic upstream legislative framework or host government PSA agreement, or as the case may be. So fundamentally, there's a connectivity in law running all the way from foreign exchange regulations, environmental laws. It's a network of laws, and we need to get that entire package right so that we attract investments, particularly in a frontier jurisdiction like South Africa.
I see Zion was nodding when you were speaking, so I want to hear his thoughts.
Well, I think I have a couple of comments. First on the CEMAC issue. The old regulatory world, if I can use that, is agreed on certain principles, unfettered access to funds for investors, repatriation, ability to deal in currencies without, undue restrictions and all that. What the CEMAC has done is quite strange in terms of regulation and foreign exchange control, and that would significantly and has been significantly hampering operations. And what's sad about this is that it actually affects the local players even more than the other, IOCs and other international players who certainly have forex available to them abroad. So it's inconceivable why these regulations have not still been done away with. In terms of South Africa, I think South Africa is perhaps learned from other jurisdictions. What I've seen in South Africa is deep engagement with the industry. I was at a conference recently where the regulators were really talking about inviting investors to have that conversation. They would always be there to. I think that's the way to go. Maybe I reiterate that, you have your laws which are set, for a number of years, which will have the general principles. Government already has this policy, opened up policy to, accept investors and, incentivize investments in the country. On the regulatory aspect is where you can tinker and, ensure that you meet unforeseen changes in the industry, and you're able to engage, with the investment community to, get the activities you want to get going. As I said, it's a multiple-edged sword. You can incentivize or disincentivize things. So government must focus on regulation to ensure it's also a signal to investors that you do want these activities, to continue. But apart from regulation, I think the local private sector or wherever the investors are also have to be quite active. The success story in terms of local content regulation, local content prominence in Nigeria, I feel is not just about the regulation. The framework was there and it's exemplary, but what has happened is that even the local private sector actually took initiatives, went to court when it was necessary, like the Ladol case, ensured that they were right there, knocking at the door of government, and also of investors got involved in the entire value chain, and that's why you have so many independents doing very well in Nigeria. Ghana also, I think Ghana is always a good example in certain ways, but I think practically Nigeria has done very well on the local private sector aspect of things. I think one other thing to perhaps CEMAC might borrow is what I now call the Nigerian model. If you look at the Petroleum Industry Act, in terms of approvals, if within a period an approval has not been denied, it is deemed as given. So there's so many tools in terms of drafting, in terms of structuring regulation to incentivize. I think this is a period for incentivizing investment and not. So I feel the CEMAC situation is quite, it's unthinkable, you know, at this point in time.
Thank you. And you touched on so many things that I want to sort of zero in on. You touched on government and, you know, IOC's engagement, or government and local companies' engagement to better identify areas and create laws. And then you also touched on sort of tying in certain loopholes, in regulatory loopholes. So I want to just ask the panelists quickly, like from your experience, and this is just, I want to identify or tease out certain areas that you have identified as challenges, or like in regulations or legislation that have affected or that continue to affect investors coming into the country and local players.
Well, I think the way, for example, local content regulation is set up in many countries is probably not efficient. So you do not want to restrict or reduce certain things to box-ticking activities. So I have done this number of trainings. I have, without positive engagement, and that's why, as I've said, this dispensation for the local private sector to thrive is not a tax Peter to pay Paul kind of situation. Incentivize the local private sector in such a way that they'll be attractive to financing institutions, and even on a value chain, you know, basis, the IOCs and international investors will want to do business with them to, you know, take advantage of, you know, the incentives they have, and that, you know, brings in financing and brings in support, brings in technology transfer. So do not make it a tax, you know, on the IOCs. You know, you have so many things to do. Investors don't like to be told what to do with their funds, even if they will do it, even if it's not, you know, significant. But the way to, you know, engineer such you know, an industry where all the players, both local and foreign, can work together, and you know, access to finance can be a lot easier for the private sector. So I think those things should be parallel. Incentivize both, even if you want IOCs to, you know, do more in terms of the local private sector, incentivize that activity so that if you've done so much, then you have so much, you know, of the, you know, of incentives to support your activity. And I think just thinking around along those lines would really be helpful, I believe, and also having a signal, like a direct signal. I like the way the local content regulation in Nigeria is. It has, you know, thresholds, very clear. I think Angola has something similar as well, so that there's no doubt as to, you know, what is required, and you know when you've complied and when you've not, because sometimes compliance becomes a problem if you have regulations that are not very clear. So those are two aspects, I think, yeah.
Leoncio, do you want to?
Yes, thank you, Naika. I think that local content, as you just mentioned, is good. It's good. But I think we're facing there a danger, you know, where you have the state really dictating how companies operate or who can they do business with. I think that is a danger. What I would prefer is to have countries, you know, to have laws that allow internal, you know, companies to do businesses, and also to attract foreign investors. You don't attract someone to your economy, to your house, by telling him who to be, you know, his partner. That should be based on merit. I think that's a key point. And I think that's why most local content regulation in Africa have failed. Because we have been really trying, you know, to just make some gains, but not to create real companies. And I think that is an issue that we need to recognize and fix in Africa. The other dimension is that we should start talking about African content, not local content. And it's where I want to really bring, you know, the African Trade Agreement that was being adopted. And I think we in Africa should really make sure that we implement it, not just have it, you know, on papers. It should really be implemented. Because that would allow, you know, we as Africans, you know, to do business between us, to freely move, you know, goods and services between our countries. And that would create, you know, strong economies. So right now, we are saying now we don't have the access to finance, but well, why do you think Europeans should be investing or financing African projects? It doesn't make sense. And I don't blame them. You know, I mean, this world, this is an economic world. Why would I be giving, you know, incentives and money to my adversary economically? You know, for us, we should make sure that we mobilize internal money in Africa, you know, between our countries, our companies, and so that we can create, you know, businesses and jobs for our people. What I would say about CEMAC, again, because this is something that is affecting us in the region, is that we, being part of that region, we should keep pushing, you know, to really push back to abandon that regulation, because it's killing jobs, it's killing companies, and it's not making life easy for IOCs. That's why you're seeing people like ExxonMobil trying to get out from CEMAC. Hess, 2 years ago, they sell out their asset in EG, and they left. Because the environment is just becoming, you know, difficult for everyone. And we are paying the price, local companies. And if you want to talk about economy, the economy is those people that, you know, are really trying to do something on their own. I don't like, I mean, this is Leoncio speaking. I don't like really the government to telling me what to do. I want them just to just put in place, you know, a regulation that would allow me to prosper, period.
Thanks, Leoncio. And you touched on the AFCFTA, which is something very important, right? That legislation created the largest free trade zone in the world. And we're expecting free movement, free trades among African countries. And so I want to just ask Megan quickly, do you think that legislation can facilitate collaboration in the African oil and gas industry in terms of trade, in terms of security, energy security, infrastructure, creation, development as well?
Well, there's definitely Africa at play here, right? We have 54 out of 55 African states which have signed the free trade agreement. So there's definitely a big movement. For the oil and gas sector specifically, absolutely. Through the free trade agreement, we will essentially be opening up access to regional markets. So projects which essentially had a national focus, particularly gas projects, right? They have a national focus. They now benefit from potentially regional development with reduced tariffs in place, free movements of capital, free movements of business travel, the benefits of the free trade agreement, and one must say that under the disclaimer that implementation of this is key. We're not quite there yet. This is a fairly new agreement. I think implementation on phase 1 started January 2021. So it's a fairly young, ambitious agreement, but the principles are correct. The principles for investment on a regional scale, the principles for moving a product and developing a product essentially from its original state into a consumer end state, such as refining of crude oil within a regional space, are dynamic opportunities for oil and gas companies in terms of monetizing projects which potentially they wouldn't have monetized before. Due to high capex costs. You're now looking at it from a regional perspective as opposed to a national perspective. So it creates a fundamental and critical corridor for these types of projects to essentially get off the ground. I mean, one of the key areas as well is infrastructure development. Just the ability to look at a project regionally and develop a pipeline structure on a regional basis is phenomenal for oil and gas companies. We've offered them this through the free trade agreement. So it certainly is one to watch, and it certainly will help towards sort of liberalization and harmonization of these regulatory frameworks that we all complain about as a panel. So yes, certainly is one to watch.
Zion, I want to get your thoughts, especially as it relates to building regional strength and leveraging that for financing, future financing for projects.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the Africa, free trade area and things like that, I think Africans, have to really get serious about that. There's a lot of talk about it, but certain things which we want to shy away from, like movement of people, there are things that, you know, we can do for long if we really want to, you know, take the benefits of trade. Nations are not born in nature, they're born in history. So if we let our historical divides shape, you know, take away from our natural comparative advantage and our ability to compete in the world, in the long run, the whole of Africa stands to lose. We have to, I think, decide in Africa, do we want to continue to be poor nations with tall walls, or wealthy nations with picket fences? You know, the idea is we have to think deeply about that and collaborate, so that when you have a $40 billion project in Mozambique, the opportunities for trade within the region, it's a $40 billion project for the South African, you know, region and, you know, the entire, you know, Africa. We have to think deeply. We have to do things together. The opportunities to connect our economies through perhaps a rail system across the continent. We have the gas to power, you know, things like that. For the oil and gas industry, we have to think about, you know, how that plays as well. I always say to the mineral resources sector, the mineral resources that would power, that would be feedstock for industries of the future. It's all in Africa. DRC, I always say, should be perhaps the wealthiest country in the world if natural resources were being, you know, counted. So we have to think about where our advantages are across the continent, link those things, link our power, because mineral resources development also requires a lot of energy, link the industries with transportation, things like that. And it starts from the oil and gas industry, because it has powered the world. It needs to power Africa. We have a lot of gas. We have to make that count. So there has to be that convergence, serious terms, you know, no holds barred, ensuring that this is for posterity. Africa must actually come together at the table, and let's just forget about our divides and, you know, move forward.
Thank you. Leoncio, let's zero in on the CEMAC region. I just want to know your thoughts on how you think the interplay between, you know, the intention of the AFCFTA and the CEMAC regulations. How do you think that's going to work in the future?
I think the intentions are there, and they are good. And I think in Africa, we don't lack laws. I think it's the implementation. And that it happens in every country in Africa. You know, we have good laws, but now we don't implement them as they should be. Yeah. In my region, CEMAC, we have a free trade agreement between our country. But still, for me to fly to Cameroon, I need a visa. But the law says I should not be asking for, you know, for a visa. For me to go to Chad, I need a visa. But within CEMAC, we have the agreement that says I should be freely traveling, you know, between CEMAC. So it doesn't make sense. So as my friend said, Zion, we need to be serious about that, about implementing what we have agreed and signed as sovereign countries. We can only be, I mean, if we sign laws and we don't implement them, how do we expect people from outside to come and invest into our countries? CEMAC, for me to go to Gabon, I need a visa, where by law I should not be asked for a visa. Now, if that is happening at CEMAC region, now talk about the AFTA, the African Free Trade. You see, it becomes like something out of space. But that should not be happening. Sometimes, you know, when I go to Europe, I have a good friend in Madrid. It's called Anselmo. We take a car from Madrid, Paris, Brussels, and no one stops you in the road. You know, from Madrid, Paris, Brussels, and we come back. They have, you know, political, you know, borders. But physically, you know, in Africa, we have those colonial, you know, instruments that we still really like enforcing on ourselves. Borders between Africa. I think that really has to disappear if we want to really go to the next stage. When I came here to Cape Town, I spent 2 days in Addis Ababa. Malabo, Addis, Cape Town, 2 days. A guy from Madrid fly to London the same day and come back. Do you see the potential that we have? But we are not really using that potential. Africa has 1.3 billion people, almost the double of Europe. But we have an economy that is just like dying. Why? Because we still maintain those colonial institutions, those borders that, Africa was supposed to be one country. And I think is what we should be tending to as people. In Europe, you have many countries, but they are one country in reality because they can move freely between themselves. Why don't we adopt the same attitude here in Africa? I want to do business in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Congo, in Malawi, but today I just cannot. Why? Because you have those impediments, those borders that are really being enforced by ourselves. It's like, it's kind of crazy.
I agree, especially if we want to sort of create that regional collaboration and build Africa as a powerhouse in the energy sector, definitely. Let's talk about something really big in the energy industry right now, energy transition and clean energy. And I'm just going to ask a direct question from a regulatory perspective, from a government perspective. Are we ready for energy transition in Africa?
Let me take on that one.
From a regulator, do we have laws for this?
I think we should not be in Africa adopting, things that are not really, don't really make sense for us at this stage. My grandmother back home, she needs to really have access to cooking, to gas. We produce gas in EG. Why would I be, abandoning my gas to embrace something that is not even there? It doesn't make sense. It's not because we don't believe in climate change. Yes, it's real. It's happening. But I think we should be mindful and we should take care of people before the climate. Because if my grandmother cannot cook, if I cannot, have access to a clean water or clean hospital, so I'm going to die. You see? I think Africa has to be realistic about this. We should not be implementing things that are not really okay for us, for our economies, for our people. Of course, gradually, we would be getting there. But today, we just cannot abandon oil and gas to embrace things that are not really there for us.
I understand, but let's focus on legislation, right? Because what this energy transition discussion is doing is sort of creating a new business environment, whether we admit it or we want to admit it or not. I agree that we have to explore our natural resources, but it's sort of changing, how business might be conducted even in the world and even in Africa. So the laws that we have currently, how do they stand in this new environment? And what do you think we should be doing to either adapt them, not completely, or to make room for these changes that are definitely coming? Megan, do you want to?
Yeah, I think to a large extent, there is a framework. As an African continent, most countries look at an energy mix. We don't limit ourselves because of these very problems that we have. The energy poverty crisis, just over 56% of Africans having access to electricity. So we are already in the mindset of, and I believe our regulatory frameworks reflect that, of ensuring that we incentivize the development of any natural resource that we have access to. What the energy transition, particularly from the north, is saying to Africa is that we now need to start disincentivizing the development of certain resources, such as the oil and gas resource. And this is essentially where regulators and governments need to be particularly careful. The north is moving towards disincentivization of hydrocarbon resources, development and exploration of hydrocarbon resources. Africa needs to incentivize hydrocarbon exploration and production to create a balance in the framework. So, yes, incentivization of clean fuel technologies, delivery of clean green energy, absolutely. We need to focus, and the regulators need to focus, and I believe they have focused on incentivizing renewable energy projects and putting them at the forefront, recognizing that these are projects that will do PPPs for and so forth. But we must not lose sight of the fact that we have hydrocarbon exploration and production going on the continent at the moment. The rest of the world is disincentivizing. We need a balancing act. We now need to focus on those laws and create incentivization for those activities within the jurisdiction. Ultimately, if the goal is to alleviate energy poverty and create an energy mix in any member states and as a continent as a whole, you have to look at, from an Africa perspective, both sources of energy, be it renewables or hydrocarbon, and incentivize them equally. So I think my key message is let us not lose sight of what is happening globally in terms of the disincentivization of a resource which is essentially underexplored and potentially fundamental from a gas perspective to the African jurisdiction.
Diana?
I think she's made some very brilliant points. I think in Africa, we must understand that laws, regulations, even policy track the reality of the system we are in. Many times we copy, even in our governance system, you know, many countries, the American presidential system, you do not have the American institutions that support it and ensure that it's sustained. Sometimes it's like trying to install Windows 10 on Abacus. You know, you just want, because the rest of the world is upgrading from Windows 8 to Windows 10. But you're still at this rudimentary stage where imagine that 600 million people do not have access to electricity. So, you know, what are we talking about here? Transition. Transition, the word transition is both a potential and kinetic word, meaning you're moving from somewhere to something. You have minus 600 million in terms of access to electricity. So except you have the finance to you know, build you know, the transition sources to power that in one day, there is no transition. 0 times 0 is 0. You have to start from somewhere. We have to recognize where we are. And that's where, you know, our collective strength can really, you know, come to bear here to say, okay, the rest of the world is moving. We're far behind. This is what we need to do. These are the resources we have. Let's pull that. Let's also take advantage of future industries, because also you do not want to have a situation where we are then behind again in the new phase. So we have to be thinking, you know, along those lines. And as I said, you do not always have to tax Peter to pay Paul. You can incentivize renewable energy parallel from, you know, the incentivization of the oil and gas sector, which you must do because we must produce gas to power industries. There's a lot of infrastructural deficits, and, you know, when the statistics are thrown out there sometimes, or renewable energy, wind and solar that's just electricity generation. There's real energy that's required for industry, powering industries and building industries. What do we manufacture in Africa is because we don't do that manufacturing. That's why we do not see that the amount of energy we need is significant. The energy we generate, I think only about 3% goes into manufacturing. In other climes, it's 30, 40%. And that's when and that's why our currencies are devalued, because you do not, you produce the basic forms of you know, resources, and then it comes back with value add at 3-4 times the price, and that's why you are unable to sustain with your currency. And we have to just have that picture in mind and, you know, build from where we are, be honest about where we are, build into the future, our future driven by ourselves, and not just copying hook, line, and sinker what we receive from other developed climes.
Absolutely. And I think Megan touched on it, the energy mix point, and just not de-incentivizing EMP to incentivize, you know, energy transition. We need a nice balance, right? So before we end this panel, I just want to ask all three of you, you know, is there any aspect of the energy transition discussion or you know, focus that you think our regulators can adapt into our current system to make, you know, even the EMP cleaner? For example, maybe it's the ESG policies, implementing that. I know some countries don't have proper ESG policies, for example, or environmental, laws that would make that whole, oil and gas production process even cleaner. We're not eliminating it. Is there anything that you think our regulators should at least pay attention to make, the whole process cleaner and not necessarily transition, just adapt a little bit, if I can say that.
Thank you. I think I would take an example, my own country, Equatorial Guinea, where we have a lot of gas, but we haven't really, done a good job in using that gas into, methanol, LNG. Before it was being burned, but right now, we burn zero gas. Amazing. But at the same time, we use the same gas. I want to say something. When we say the rest of the world, who is the rest of the world? We are 1.3 billion people. China is almost 2 billion people. India, who is the rest of the world? Europe is just 700 million people, not even 1 billion. So when we say the rest of the world, who are we talking about? We are the majority. When you look at Africa, we have installed power capacity of 140 gigawatts, but we are 1.3 billion people. Europe, they have 1,000 plus gigawatt installed capacity of power. They are half of our population. That's why I want to really come back into what I said before. We need to have access to power to really build our industries together. We have only 140 gigawatt installed capacity in Africa. The world continent for 1.6 billion people. Europe, they have 1,000 plus gigawatt installed. We need to get to the level where we can really build strong industries and strong economies. What I would recommend is to really, to incentivize in the investment of clean use of what we have, such as gas. Nigeria has a lot of gas, but when you go across Nigeria, you see those flares. They're burning gas. I think that gas could be captured and used to power Nigeria, and even to see that gas and sell it, across the borders, such as Egypt, Cameroon, and other countries. It's where we need to really direct our investment. The clean use of those fossil fuels. I think that's the African answer.
Yeah, and I agree, because I think the PIA addresses gas flaring and significantly reduces that and creates a clear, framework for gas flaring in Nigeria. Megan, do you want to add something?
And I believe, so in terms of environmental framework, it is ultimately the regulator that needs to put this in place, having due regard to the particular activity being conducted. So it is quite a specific exercise, and you're quite right in saying that, in certain jurisdictions we simply have no regulations on those. We aren't as advanced as the North in terms of, the environmental structures, and surprisingly, these are the things that oil companies are quite key. When they look at a jurisdiction, one of the things that flags is, what are the environmental law processes? I've worked with oil companies who have far stricter environmental processes, HSE systems in place than what the laws of a particular country had in place. So oil companies certainly do self-regulate from an environmental law perspective. And here's an opportunity for regulators to actually work with oil companies as they develop their own regulatory framework and make it more robust. To essentially learn from oil companies, because they do have robust HSE systems in-house. Building capacity in this sector, in this particular area, is critical. Regulatory bodies need to have capacity. They need to understand the processes, and they need to upskill the environmental law teams. I find that is frequently lacking. So it's a skills audit, skills capacity building in the sector, or in the environmental law area of the sector, that really does need work. In South Africa, we over-regulate the environmental law sector, surprisingly. You know, and what I find is we go through, and we make oil companies go through processes where they need to go and sit in public consultations and essentially explain to, you know, farmers, fishermen, what they plan to do in the, you know, in the ocean or, you know, close to their farms. And it creates a sense of, first of all, these are very technical discussions. These processes are not necessarily immediately understood by the man on the street. You go on Google and you type shale gas and you get all sorts of, you know, flares coming out of taps, kitchen taps and things. So communicating the correct message is not for the oil company. It is for the local participants. It is for government regulatory bodies to explain these processes to the people. We often put it on the oil companies, the European oil companies, to explain to our locals what is happening in terms of extracting this resource. And that's a fundamental mistake that we make, because it invokes an emotional reaction, because we are not communicating to locals as locals. Yeah. As to the importance of this project and essentially what the project entails, explaining it in languages that people understand. I mean, we have so many languages in South Africa. So in the environmental space in South Africa, we have over-regulated, and that's a point which I want to make regulators should steer clear of. So we see two extremes. There's an under-regulation, and then there's an over-regulation with, like, too many public consultations, you know, explaining too many difficult technical terms to the public. I mean, this is not something the public should be making a call on. It is something the government regulators who are skilled and equipped to look at the environmental processes and the HSE policies and practices in place for a particular project, and then make an informed assessment as to what, and it is project specific. I don't think that we can govern this under, you know, robustly under a piece of legislation. We can certainly provide the framework, but each project has with it significant deviations and, you know, nuances that need to be accounted for. So it's a complex answer because it's a complex area.
Thanks, Megan. Zion, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, I always like to start this discussion by just highlighting that Africa, for example, contributes less than 10% or about 5% of emissions. And when you look at the play and the new, you know, dispensation and what's being discussed in Europe and America, I don't subscribe to the idea that it's against Africa, but I feel that they're making those decisions based on where they are. Now, we've powered the industries, we've reached the tech stage, we have electricity, you know, and now we are focusing on the environment. So there are two different houses, one in the village, one somewhere. You all wake up, you say, we're going to the mall, or we're going to, you know, play tennis. The other person wakes up in the morning and says, I have to go to the farm to get the food I'm going to eat. So in between that, the decision you take for the future or for the next few hours depends on what your situation is. What we're saying in Africa is that we still need to generate, you know, power and energy to power industries to get to that level where, you know, the environment must always be, you know, at a stage or at a pedestal where everyone thinks about it and tries to ensure that the environment is better. But I don't think Africa should take the giant share of, you know, the stress in terms of it will take a lot of pain to achieve those things. And I feel gas is a winner. Gas is 30% cleaner than oil. And when you now then, you know, translate that to coal, I don't know, you know, how that translates. We're saying we have gas, we want to develop gas. And I don't think the production is where the problem is, especially the oil and gas industry has continued to be more environmentally responsible. It's the use. So if we all move to gas, South Africa, for example, uses a lot of coal. Let there be a transition to gas, which is abundant in Africa. A lot of it's in Mozambique, which is a neighbor. There's an opportunity for trade. South Africa can develop its own gas. So let's have those frank discussions about, you know, our current positioning and how we can move progressively to a cleaner environment. But then the US and China would have to take the giant, you know, nozzle on this at this point while Africa develops. Africa needs a ramp-up period. Let's just be honest about it, because this is where you have the young, vibrant population for the next 40, 50 years. The average age in Africa is 19 years. So when you're thinking about the future, if Africa is left behind and we all just drive Teslas, you know, in Europe, and you leave Africa behind, the humanitarian, the unrest, issues that would arrive in, will arise in Africa would even be more dire than, the environmental issues we're talking about. So this has to be we have to look inwards and make our presentation to the world and engage with the world on that basis.
Thank you all so very much. We have come to the end of this panel, but before I throw it to the audience for questions, any last remarks from my esteemed panelists?
Yes, I want to say one last thing. When the pandemic, hit all of us 2 years ago, we saw reaction from the West. Okay, we saw government supporting companies. Germany alone, they put out there $1.2 trillion to support SMEs and medium-sized companies. In the US, they put in place $2 trillion package support. Did you see in Africa anything, any reaction? Zero, nothing. Nothing. That's why, we're saying that in our continent, we have to really understand that the businesses, SMEs, are the engine of our economies. If we don't support them, then we cannot really get to the next stage. And that's my message to our governments, to really put in place laws, and mechanisms that support the small business guys, people, and not just, raise taxes and go to the IMF for loans that we cannot afford to pay.
Thank you, Leoncio. Megan, any last remarks before I throw it to the audience?
Happy to move to the audience.
Okay, I'm just going to move to the audience. Okay, thank you very much. Any questions from the audience to my panelists? Thank you very much. In the absence of questions, this session has now come to an end. Thank you for staying and listening to us. I will now hand over to Megan, the MC for this venue. A round of applause for our panelists, guys, please. Thank you very much.